topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Well, welcome. This is the Bill Martinez Show. Great to have you with us, sharing a part of your day. For more information on the show, check it out, BillMartinezShow.com. We're going to have Sean Mirski up in just a moment to talk about his new book, We May Dominate the World, Ambition, Anxiety, and the Rise of the American Colossus. In his debut book that I just mentioned, Sean Mirski, the lawyer and U.S. foreign policy scholar who has worked on national security issues across multiple U.S. presidential administrations, examines a lost chapter of American foreign policy. And this is incredibly interesting. And I think you're going to sense the light bulbs going on as you listen to what Sean has to share with us, specifically the period from the Civil War to the end of World War II in Latin and South America that illustrates how the U.S. went from a regional hegemony to a global superpower. Sean Mirski, welcome to the show. Good to have you with us. Well, Sean, why this book?
In one word, China. It's a truism of international relations that rising powers tend to be aggressive and expansionist, by which I mean that they tend to pick fights with other great powers, they tend to bully their neighbors, and then they tend to dominate greater and greater slices of the world. And I think China's bearing that out, but there's still a very long runway. And so one of the questions that I had in my head was, why is it that rising powers act this way? And by understanding why they act this way, is there any way that we can help divert China onto a more peaceful path? And so I thought it would be interesting to look at the example of the United States, whose rise, of course, was, I think, astronomical, but at the same time was not quite as consistent with American values as we might like to think. And so that's ultimately where this book came from.
So you might say in the early days, as America was spreading from east to west, that we were a bit of a bully?
You could definitely say that. I mean, certainly at the objective level, our foreign policy is filled to the brim with interventions, annexations, wars, and all of it, I think, ends up being much more aggressive and offensive than I think most Americans would appreciate. And the heart of my book focuses on this period from 1898 to 1918, where we just really went on a rampage through our region. We were using force against our neighbors an average of nearly 3 times a year. And in many circumstances, these are stories that I think the average American, and certainly I didn't know prior to kind of looking into these things, but it's an important part of our history.
Well, and what you point out is what academia has been pointing out to the kids in school. And this has given rise to a bit of this anti-American sentiment, has it not?
Well, certainly the U.S. record, as I said, is not exactly consistent, I think, with the best view of that Americans often hold of themselves. But at the same time, it is part of our history. And I think it's an important part of our history that needs to be understood in order to understand both how to conduct our foreign policy today and also how to deal with foreign policy challenges like China. And one of the points that I make in the book is that even though our foreign policy record was quite aggressive, it wasn't quite the story that I think is often taught in universities today. Those stories tend to emphasize economic greed, that the U.S. Was going abroad essentially at the behest of banana companies and Wall Street banks. And I make the case that that's just really not true, that the United States was ultimately acting out of defensive motivations, even if it acted quite aggressively.
Right. Well, and I think the opportunity here, Sean, in your book goes a long way in helping us get on that trajectory, is to find that balance to where it's not necessarily all that the academia is presenting in the classroom today, that there is some good to be taken out of all this. And I think it's also an opportunity for America to kind of have a sobering perspective on how we got to where we are right now, because, you know, you and I talked about this before. I talked to people in other countries, and the way they perceive America, as you pointed out earlier, different than how we think America is. We're the country when there is a national disaster in anywhere in the world, we head on over there, we go into danger, we provide services to help people out. But it seems that it's a bit confusing for them because what they see is sometimes, something that seems to be a little bit more imperialistic.
Absolutely. And part of the problem, I think, is that Americans don't know this period of history very well. And so, for instance, most viewers or listeners might not know that we occupied the Dominican Republic for 8 years from 1960 to 1924, or Haiti from 1915 to 1934. And at the end of the day, we might have forgotten, but the Haitians certainly haven't, and the Dominicans certainly haven't. And so there is still a legacy of these interventions today that I think does color American foreign policy. But one of the other points that I think is just worth making is many conventional accounts of our behavior during this period tend to stress really malign motives. And I think the point that my book tries to make is that American values didn't disappear from the picture. It's not like the people in charge didn't care about sovereignty or classical liberal values.
Right.
Democracy. It's just that for various reasons, simply having good intentions oftentimes is not enough to prevent really tragic outcomes.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, no doubt that has been the case at times, but what I'd like to, see more, and you kind of suggest this in your book, Sean, and that is, some acknowledgement that look at nobody's perfect here. This was our intent. We may have made some mistakes, or we did make some mistakes, not even made some mistakes. And, let's learn from that. It's kind of like the issue, the current issue, or the most recent one, was how we got out of Afghanistan. I don't think we're fully transparent. And I think what we've done, kind of like you said, whether it's Haiti or the Dominican Republic, we came, we went, we left a mess. And I can't help but feel for the people of Afghanistan who enjoyed some freedoms and liberties like they hadn't before for 20 years. And then suddenly the carpet was pulled out from underneath them.
Yeah, and the parallels between our interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq and the interventions that I talk about in the book are really quite remarkable, because I think in both cases, much of what we are trying to do is essentially to nation build, to go in, to set up political, economic, and social institutions that would set up a peaceful, stable political order for the people in those countries. And in doing so, I think our motives weren't necessarily selfless. There were security reasons that we wanted to do that. But at the same time, we genuinely believed that what we were doing would be helpful not only to ourselves, but also to the people of the nations we were intervening in. Unfortunately, again, good intentions don't always translate into successful outcomes. And I think some of the same mistakes that we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan can really actually be traced back to the interventions in the 1900s and the 1910s, where again, we went in with good intentions, but we didn't really understand the local political culture. We didn't really understand how forcible stabilization oftentimes has negative consequences and perverse incentives, and sets up all sorts of mechanisms and dynamics that can really lead to trouble down the road. And it seems like a lesson that we have to keep relearning as a nation, from Vietnam and Korea all the way down to, as I said, Afghanistan and Iraq.
And we need to slow down here a bit. And I think you touched on something that's so key in all this. And I hope our viewers are catching this. And that is, we didn't fully understand. I mean, you go into the Middle East and you've got thousands of years of tradition and history. And we come in with our Western idea thinking we're all that in a bag of chips. And we end up turning the tables upside down and confuse the holy what have you out of the people that, they're trying to figure out. All they want to do is, like everybody else, find some peace to where they can provide for their families, educate their children, and life goes on. And then we come in and think, oh, we're all that. We've got these great Western ideas that are so innovative and everything. And they're going, well, that's fine for you, but that isn't necessarily important. No, but you're going to do that. You're going to love it, right?
Yeah, well, and a significant part of the problem was that I think there was a real reluctance among American statesmen to get involved. And so there was a real search for kind of silver bullet solutions. They'll like, if you just tweak this one thing, if you just make this one reform, then somehow this is going to solve all of these very deep-seated problems in the nations we're intervening in. And so just to give you one example, one of the solutions that we thought was would just sort of solve everything was taking control of the custom houses of the nations we were intervening in. And just by way of background, at this in this time period, many of our neighbors, especially in the Caribbean, almost all of their domestic income came from taxes on customs. There was no income tax, there was nothing like that. And so if you look at Haiti or Dominican finances, nearly all of it was coming from taxing trade in the form of customs. And that meant that if you could seize the custom houses, the actual taxing authorities in a given port, you would essentially gain control over the entire stream of revenue for a government. And our perspective was, look, we'll just go into these nations, we'll essentially seize these custom houses, sometimes with their consent, sometimes not. And by doing so, we can basically make sure that their customs are run in a non-corrupt way. We can make sure the money goes where it needs to. And most importantly, we can protect those customs from rebels and revolutionaries. And so the idea was, as long as you have Americans administering the customs, then everything would be fine, and revolutions and civil war would fade away, and these nations would go into this unprecedented bout of prosperity. Not exactly the way it happened, and for a lot of different reasons, but at least one of them was that a lot of these nations didn't really appreciate having their customs taken over by American officials, much in the same way that we wouldn't really appreciate it if the IRS was taken over by China. And so, it exemplifies, I think, though, part of what you're talking about, which is this sense that, well, we can fix these things just by applying sort of American ingenuity and values. And unfortunately, it just didn't turn out that way.
Yeah, the culture is so important, no doubt. We're talking to Sean Mirski, his book, We May Dominate the World, Ambition, Anxiety, and the Rise of American Colossus. You have so many stories in your book here, Sean, and I just, I want to hear more of the examples, these clear examples of where, I want to say that our arrogance got in the way, and maybe we could have been better global partners at the end of the day. That was my takeaway that I got from your book, is that we could be, even now, it's not all to hell in a handbasket. I think that some of this is retrievable to where we could, God willing, be able to be, better neighbors, better partners, and have better allies if we come alongside them in a more holistic and constructive manner.
Yeah, and in many ways, in a way that doesn't involve us directly governing these places. I mean, I'll give you an example. In Haiti, for instance, in 1915, the president of Haiti was assassinated quite brutally. He was essentially dragged out of the French legation where he had been hiding, and he was torn apart by a mob on the streets of Port-au-Prince. And this wasn't unprecedented in Haitian history. In fact, in the last 7 years, the country had churned through 7 presidents. I mean, it was just one president after another was knocked out of office or assassinated.
Yeah, when you love that job, hey, you have been elected to be president. No, I like living. I'm going to pass.
As I said, the presidency of Haiti was an actuarial nightmare for that reason.
I bet,
But from our perspective, this really was sort of the final straw, because the violation of the French legation led American policymakers to conclude that it would be very, very difficult for European nations not to land forces if we didn't. And so as a sort of preemptive measure, we ended up landing forces. And one thing led to another, and our initial landing of forces in the capital led to the occupation of the full country. And as I said, this was never intended to sort of be this long-run occupation. In fact, there was never really any sort of clear plan at all. But once we got in, it was very easy to let things sort of drag on and on and on. And it was only in the late 1920s and early 30s where there were some significant human rights atrocities that led to this global outcry that the United States finally left. And in a lot of ways, it's hard not to draw the parallel to Afghanistan, where, again, we went in 2001. We initially stayed in the capital. There wasn't this full-scale occupation. But over time, we decided that to achieve our objectives, we needed to occupy the entire country and govern it in its place. And then 20 years later, we left and the whole thing fell apart. And again, Haiti, as we know from Haiti's political situation today, something very similar happened in Haiti.
Yeah, sadly. As you were putting this book and doing all the research for it, Sean, how much of your initial idea changed? And I got to imagine, with all these stories and the revealing of history, I mean, maybe your initial theory on this book had a certain formation, and then all of a sudden this started growing in inertia, and you end up with a deeper story.
Yeah, so the story definitely the story changed, the theory changed. I mean, at the end of the day, being a good historian means when you're confronted with new evidence, you don't try and warp it into an existing theory. Instead, you just look at it, and if it change, and your theory has to change, not the evidence, right? But it was funny because unlike most issues that I explore, I really went into this with no preconceived notions, in part because I knew almost nothing about it. And so I was very much a blank slate. And I remember reading some of the initial primary source documents and sort of being struck by how much there was a preemptive defensive security kind of undertone to much of what the United States was doing, this desire to keep European nations out of the Western Hemisphere. And the thing that I started to see the more and more I read and the more I started looking in the archives was that this was a theme that just ran throughout American foreign policy. And there were certainly exceptions. There were interventions that didn't really involve that. And in many cases, interventions had other motivations. There's no clean kind of story to be told here necessarily. But there was enough there that as I started to go through it, I realized that there really was an underlying theme that was relevant, and frankly, relevant not just to our experience, but to the experience of rising powers everywhere.
Exactly. Right off the top, you address weakness offers temptation. And this has been a recurring theme that we've heard over the last couple of years, is that, America's weakness is emboldening those new bullies on the block. So this has universality, context, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And there's a little bit of a inside joke in that title, because part of it is, in fact, the weakness of the United States offering temptations. And the line, weakness offers temptations, comes from a diplomatic dispatch that was sent by Secretary William Seward during the Civil War. And he was essentially saying that the weakness of the United States, which of course was tearing itself apart, meant that it offered European nations an opportunity to intervene in the New World. And they absolutely did. Spain recolonized the Dominican Republic. France invaded and occupied all of Mexico, which is something I think a lot of Americans don't appreciate about, the world during the Civil War. And all of this was directly driven by American weakness. At the same time, though, the weakness offers temptations was not just the weakness of the United States, of a strong power, but also the weakness of the United States' neighbors. It was the Dominican Republic's chronic instability and civil war and revolution, and Mexico's chronic civil war and revolution that offered European nations an entry point into their affairs. And so one of the key lessons that came out of the Civil War for American statesmen was, not only should the United States not be weak, but we need to make sure that all of our neighbors are strong and stable as well, because that's the only way that they can keep out our European rivals.
And I think also during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln realized the power of unity and what he had to do in order, to hold this democratic republic together. He sacrificed his own life for the sake of unity. And I know we hear this time and again, but it's built into our name, the United States of America. And when we become disunited, which you could argue that we are today, this is very dangerous. It leaves us quite vulnerable, doesn't it?
Absolutely. One of the fun factoids of American history is that before the Civil War, the United States was often a plural noun, which is to say that someone would say that the United States are a thriving democracy.
Right.
And it was only after the Civil War that it started to become a singular noun. The United States is a thriving democracy. And part of that was because there was this understanding that the United States had to stay united in order to effectively meet the threats it was facing outside of its borders. Certainly, if the Confederacy had prevailed during the Civil War, the entire course of world history would have been quite different. There's just no chance that the United States would have ended up being the same kind of global superpower that it is today.
Yeah, without a doubt. We're talking with Sean Mirski, his new book, We May Dominate the World, Ambition, Anxiety, and the Rise of the American Colossus. Interesting, the pattern that's laid out here, Sean, is typical of all bully nations, isn't it, in a sense?
Yeah, right. Rising. I mean, all great powers tend to meddle in the affairs of their neighbors. It's almost inevitable that if you have enough power, you're going to do it.
Mm.
But rising powers, in particular, really tend to exhibit and exemplify this behavior. And part of the reason I wrote the book was to try to figure out why that was the case. And I make the argument, at least in the book, that part of it really is this sort of preemptive desire to preempt one's rivals from consolidating their influence in your neighborhood. And so in the case of the United States, so much of our policy was driven by the Monroe Doctrine, which listeners might remember from their U.S. history classes in high school, was this declaration in 1823 that the European nations are going to stay on their side of the ocean, we're going to stay on ours, and there's going to be a big keep out sign in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that prevents Europe from coming and recolonizing any part of the hemisphere. And for many decades, we didn't take that very seriously. But after the Civil War, it became the guiding star of American policy. It was literally the most important thing for our grand strategy right up until the start of the Cold War. And really, it ended up coloring almost everything that we did.
Well, Sean, some are suggesting we need to review and reform the Monroe Doctrine in the context of today's emerging threats like China.
Absolutely. One of those people is me. I wrote a op-ed in the Washington Post.
I heard it.
Yeah. I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post making the case for a revised Monroe Doctrine, in large part because since the end of the Cold War, we for many decades didn't have a reason to be worried about the expansion of foreign rival influence into the Western Hemisphere. But that's unfortunately starting to change. China is really expanding its influence in the hemisphere, and part of that is just commerce. China's trading more with our neighbors, and of course that's to be expected and even welcomed. Unfortunately, a large part of Chinese expansion is much more political, strategic, and even military in nature. A month or two ago, the Wall Street Journal reported that China has established 4 different listening stations in Cuba, essentially to spy on American traffic in the Gulf. And there's talk as well of setting up a joint training facility between the Chinese and the Cubans that would see Chinese troops stationed on Cuban soil. And it's these sort of entry points that I think should be concerning to Americans, because one of our greatest advantages as a superpower is the fact that we don't have other great powers at our doorsteps, that we're able to go around the world and do essentially as we please, while other nations have to worry about what's happening in their immediate neighborhood. And so that's something I think we do need to focus on.
But our southern border is wide open, and we already have reports, Sean, that the Chinese are staging fighting men age Chinese insurgents who are already coming through our southern border. They're paying off the cartel to enter. We don't know what kind of numbers that is, but it seems like it is a growing concern. Well, not for Mayorkas and the Biden administration. They don't seem to be paying attention. But, for those of us that see this emerging threat, because China's made it clear they want to be the number one dominant force in the world. End of story.
Yeah, well, and one of the, I can't speak to those particular reports. I will say that one of the things that seems to be going through China's head is China doesn't like the fact that we've got military troops stationed all around its borders. It doesn't like our involvement in Taiwan. And so I think in some ways, China's just mirroring our behavior and trying to set up shop in the Western Hemisphere as a way of sending us a message that, hey, if you do this, we can do this as well. And so there definitely is this sort of global contest for supremacy that is starting to develop.
Well, in much the same way, like what happened in Ukraine with Russia, America has allowed China to expand and claim sovereignty in the South China Sea, which is increasingly problematic here. And it's like that old saying, you can pay me now or pay me later. The idea of paying now, it's less expensive and less complicated. Later, it gets more complicated in much the same way as we saw Russian troops mounting along the border of Ukraine. They weren't coming out there just for a bivouac and an overnight stay. They were set up definitely for a military operation.
Absolutely. I mean, and part of the parallel again, to the United States' rise is just really hard to miss. We used to say during this period that the United States was turning the Caribbean into its own Mediterranean in the way that the Great Britain, the preeminent navy of the time, had turned the Mediterranean into its own lake. And so we turned the Caribbean into our own lake. But now you can actually see the Chinese talking about turning the South China Sea into their own Caribbean. There's this direct sort of parallel where they're looking at what we did and saying, you know what, if this worked for the United States, this should work for us as well. And so you absolutely see that expansion of Chinese influence in the South China Sea, everything from the 9-dash line to, I think, reports that came out this morning and last night that the Chinese are yet again building an airstrip on one of the contested islands in the South China Sea. And so again, it's not that dissimilar from the way in which we built naval bases throughout the Caribbean as we are rising.
Yeah, and so here they are. I mean, we see it as a threat. You hear, our elected officials in our government, citing it as a threat, but they don't do anything about it, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, and part of it is that there's a genuinely, it's genuinely difficult to know what to do in a sense. I mean, it doesn't obviously make sense to go to war over, the construction of an airstrip in the South China Sea, but at the same time, this is part of China's strategy. It's a salami slicing strategy where bit by bit they do things that individually don't amount to a casus belli, but at the end of the day can leave the United States in a much more perilous strategic situation. I will say that I'm greatly disheartened by the polarization in this country, but it has cheered me a little bit over the last couple of years to see how much there is developing a consensus around China and the need to do more about China. And certainly there's criticism, I think, that can be leveled of both the Trump and Biden administration policies, but and I would also argue the consensus is not moving fast enough and far enough, but at least we're trending in the right direction. I think we are waking up to the fact that for several decades, we have been in a competition with China and China's been competing and we just haven't. And in fact, we've been helping them in significant ways.
Yeah, I would agree with you 100% on that, Sean, because the thing is I've often said that experience defines preference. We had a lot of experience in the last couple of decades with China, and we're seeing that when they say something, they mean it, and nothing's going to stop them, whether it's their Confucius institutes that they've set up, over 40 in the universities here in the United States, an outpost on Cuba, 6, 7 police stations, capturing our elected officials, the capturing of princelings, as Miranda Devine calls them, which are the relatives like the Hunter Biden, the sons and daughters of elected officials. Because, believe it or not, I mean, some of these politicians still have a little bit of a conscience and they want to not be so overt about taking, direct bribes, but it's okay if their children are ingratiated. Somehow they feel like that's an end around and acceptable when we know darn well it's not.
Yeah, well, and I, as a parenthetical, it's remarkable how long this practice has been going on. I mean, even during the 1920s, 1930s, you saw American banks at the time hiring the sons of dictators in the Caribbean to curry favor and get loans and things like that. So it really is remarkable how much sometimes the interests of the business community don't necessarily align with American security imperatives.
Well, like you say, there's nothing new under the sun, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out when you get elected officials who come in and, they might be pretty well heeled financially. And somehow when they leave office, they're 100 times more wealthy on in today's standards, maybe $170,000, $180,000 a year. How do you make these mega millions of dollars? I mean, you got your own, private lotto campaign that's happening in the back room there in the Senate or in the House.
Yeah, well, and part of the problem, obviously, too, is the Congress's failure to pass some restrictions on its own ability to trade in stocks and things like that. But at the end of the day, we have, I think, a long way to go on reform. But I will say that the situation has vastly improved over time. If you look back at American history in the 1870s and the 1880s, the amount of kleptocracy was just absolutely astronomical. But in part because people like you and people throughout the country are raising these concerns and putting pressure on elected officials, it does make a difference. It ultimately does make a difference and helps lead to the sort of reforms that align elected officials' interests with our own.
Well, Sean Mirski, they took a little pause there for a while, a couple of years ago, when it came out, and even Nancy Pelosi had said, hey, look, we got to back off on this. We're being a little too obvious, But they just paused for a moment, gave a show to everybody, and then it's business as usual.
Unfortunately, it does oftentimes seem to be 2 steps forward and 1.5 steps back. So
right,
it's a slow process.
Well, it's our humanity. We just cannot. We cannot help ourselves. It's not like we expect everybody to be perfect, but we are striving in the spirit of our Constitution, to come to this, to arrive at this most perfect state, which is, it is a procedure and a process, but you just can't abandon it altogether without having some sort of measurement and saying, well, how are we doing relative to our Constitution and our Declaration on behalf of we the people?
Exactly. And I think that actually you put your finger on something that's sort of important, I think, to understand about the broader competition that we have with China, which is that we are very much as a nation imperfect. As my book talks about, we have made many mistakes in the past. We will make many mistakes in the future. Even internally, we're still improving, we're reforming ourselves and always trying to be a more perfect union. But none of that process, none of that imperfection, I think, means that the United States should fall into this trap of whataboutism, or essentially saying, well, for example, for Chinese officials, it's easy to say, well, the United States did many of the same things we're doing now 100 years ago. Where does the U.S. get off telling us not to do it now when they did it, a century ago? And I think it's important to sort of not fall into that trap and to sort of understand that simply because we make mistakes doesn't mean we should endorse the mistakes of others. Right. And just because, we engaged in a practice doesn't mean that that's something that we should support today, especially when it goes against our interests. And frankly, the difference between a world that's dominated by the United States and a world that's dominated by China is not it's not a difference that's going to be good for most people in the world. And exactly. So I do think it is important for kind of the American exceptionalism that it really truly is part of American foreign policy to sort of continue being an important part of our policy.
Well, to your point, it's not so tyrannical. And what's wrong with saying, hey, look, we did this. We bought the T-shirt. It is not all good news. This is what we experienced. And we want to save you from having the same complicated problem. So take our experience and do a better job at it. Because if we're consulting one another, in the spirit of unity and good for all men, I think that's a positive thing. Are we having those kind of discussions, Sean?
We are, but I think, there's always room for more of those discussions to be had. I mean, and one of the interesting things that you see is that China very much does look at the example of American policy, both present and past, to decide what policies it's going to undertake. And so, for instance, it has very much learned, at least in the short term, from our mistakes in the Middle East. It has looked at how long those interventions lasted, how much they cost us in blood and treasure. And it has said, no, thanks, we are not going to get involved in the same way. And from an American strategic perspective, that might not be the best thing. In some ways, it would be good for the Chinese to find their own Afghanistan. But certainly from the perspective of kind of their neighbors and the rest of the world, I think it's a positive development that the Chinese have sort of understood that this kind of forcible intervention from the outside can oftentimes lead to quagmires that really are not in the benefit of any nation involved. We'll see whether China kind of continues to understand that lesson. There are worrying signs that it might not, but that is at least, I think, one positive thing to come out of our experience.
Well, but Sean, I think that the American people and the world could be encouraged a little bit, because it's not like, I think sometimes our own imagination, we create China into a bigger giant in reality than what it is. I mean, they've got serious problems within their boundaries. And as you mentioned before, I mean, they have some moral deficiencies that, based on their construct, that's not going to be answered. I mean, it's impossible for them, to reach the kind of heights that they want to reach, just on sheer strength and oppression and power and tyranny. Even our founding fathers realized that. And, this is why they, in my humble opinion, why they constructed the U.S. Constitution, and God gave them, guidance in which to do that, to realize that you don't have a police force big enough to manage, even, with our population of 340 million people. I mean, the communist Chinese were talking, over a billion people population wise. How can they manage all there's not enough force in which to do that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and I think in the long term, the Chinese Communist Party is very much headed for a fall, because it really is difficult to imagine that they can sustain this forever.
Right.
And particularly when so much of the sort of implicit political bargain that they've made with their people is really starting to fray at the edges. I mean, for decades, the Chinese leaders have essentially promised economic growth and prosperity in exchange for continued communist rule. And as we all know, the Chinese economy is really starting to slow at this point, and there are cracks starting to show that might suggest China's even headed for a recession, which is a sort of remarkable come down from the rates of oftentimes 10% GDP growth that you saw in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And as that implicit bargain falls apart, I mean, the Communist Party is really looking for alternatives. One of the worrisome ones is nationalism, where the Chinese leaders are really starting to stoke Chinese nationalism as a way of essentially justifying their own continued rule. But the logical endpoint here is that if you're the Communist Party and you're saying, well, Taiwan is part of China, all, South China Sea is our exclusive province.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, you're going to get into a situation where the Chinese leaders feel that for domestic reasons, they might need to launch military interventions abroad. And so the situation, in a lot of ways, China's slowdown is good from the perspective of a long-term competition between us and the Chinese, but it's also worrisome because it can lead to incentives to use force that might set up a bigger conflict.
Yeah, when they get desperate, that creates all kinds of dominoes to fall. We're talking with Sean Mirski, his book, We May Dominate the World, Ambition, Anxiety, and the Rise of the American Colossus. Sean, the thing, as you were talking, I'm thinking, wow, New York has a lot of empty apartments, because a lot of people have left New York, and you've got a lot of empty buildings there in China as well. Maybe we can send some migrants over there, because I think New York is being overwhelmed by the number of migrants, and they're realizing, as a sanctuary city that they, so designated themselves, that they can't handle what it is they wanted.
I imagine the Chinese Communist Party would not be thrilled with that idea, but perhaps it's worth a shot.
just but the other deal too is like what we touched on earlier, Sean. I mean, you got more men. I mean, the ratio of men to women, I mean, there is no way. And you've got a lot of young men who are not married. I mean, you're going to throw them into a situation, as we're seeing in other countries, where, unmarried young men who are not having a relationship with a woman heterosexually can bode dangerous for its neighbors, because, these aren't happy campers, and they'll strike out just like you suggested.
Yeah, I mean, that's one other kind of, as you said, I think pressure on the Chinese to do something militarily. I mean, it's not unprecedented in history for nations that have, in a sense, a glut of young, unmarried men to engage in military expeditions that end up, in fact, somewhat morbidly using those men up in the course of conflicts. And so that's definitely a concern. Definitely another thing to be concerned about, I think.
See, that's the deal. See, and then you start, channeling your John Lennon, Yoko Ono. You make love, not war. You just send a bunch of women in the middle of all these fighting communist Chinese, and and they'll just feel better, and maybe we can get peace around here. I know, surely I jest, but getting back to the point here, and that is that China is emerging on all levels. As you mentioned, it's not just here, their Belt and Road Initiative, how they are, really setting things up, not only near, but, in other parts of the world.
Yeah, well, and last time we spoke, I brought up, or you brought up, the example of dollar diplomacy, which was this
Mm,
policy that was followed by the United States, starting with really the Taft administration in 1909. And
right.
the idea essentially was it was a policy with a lot of moving parts, but the essential idea was that by exerting American financial control over the Western Hemisphere, we'd be able to essentially squeeze Europe out. And so part of that was, as I mentioned earlier, seizing these custom houses. Excuse me. Part of it, though, was also refinancing loans in and around the region,
Mhm,
European loans, through
right.
American banks. And so, if Europe had taken out or had loaned, let's say, Nicaragua a significant amount of money, the United States would go into Nicaragua and essentially say, "Hey, here, let me introduce you to JP Morgan. JP Morgan is going to give you the money to pay back that loan in full. And instead of owing the money to Europe, you'll owe the money to the United States." And the idea was essentially to flush European influence out of the region, and in a
Mm,
lot of ways, it was actually quite successful.
right.
And China once again is taking a page out of the U.S. playbook. You see that with BRI, you see that with other initiatives that China's pursuing. That there is this part of what they're trying to do is they're trying to avoid having the U.S. dollar sort of be uh, well, to be both the reserve currency, but also for these loans to be owed to American banks, because they understand that loans can oftentimes be used to exert political leverage. And so more
Exactly.
and more, I think part of what you see with these Chinese loans is not just an interest in making money for the Chinese state, although that's certainly part of it, but also a desire to sort of push the United States out of its region and out of strategic areas, and also to gain the Chinese state some of its own influence.
Well, Sean, you talk about how the United States went and took over their debt basically and, loaned them money. We loan money, if the truth be known. That's kind of maybe for some a hidden secret. I think the communist Chinese owe us, trillions of dollars that they have, they've refused to pay back. They did pay back England, but they didn't pay back the United States. And that's just one of those things that's hanging out there. And I think with compound interest, I'm not sure what that has amounted to, but I know that it's over $1 trillion that they're in debt, and they're claiming, well, that's the old management. We're new management, but international law says there's no such thing as old and new management, that you carry the responsibility into the new management as well, right?
Well, and one of the that's generally speaking, that's correct as a matter of international law. One of the, I mean, oddities of our competition with China right now is the degree of interdependence, not only financially but also economically, obviously.
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
and so, on the one hand, China owes the United States money. On the other hand, we owe China lots of money. As you know, the
Mm.
Chinese have bought up U.S. bonds. I don't remember the exact statistics now, but at least for one point, they were our nation's largest external creditor.
I think
And
I've heard something like 30% or something of the 32 trillion that we're in debt, something like
yeah,
that. I
something
might be,
just
yeah,
absolutely enormous.
right.
And again, it's sort of one of the kind of oddities of the competition is trying to see how it's going to unfold in this situation. Because in the
Mhm.
past, in the Cold War, for instance, we really didn't have this type of interdependence with Russia. The Soviet Union had its own bloc, we had our bloc. Economic relations were largely within blocks as opposed to
Mhm.
across them. And so for many years, I think the kind of prevailing theory of American foreign policy was the more we integrate with China economically, the more we become interdependent, the more peaceful things will become, because China won't want to rock the boat for sort of monetary reasons.
Yeah.
And the more liberal China would become over time, liberal in a classical sense. Would democratize. It would democratize. There would be a middle class. But of course, that particular theory, I think, didn't work out.
Yeah.
And
I think that's what Richard Nixon had hoped for, right?
Richard Nixon going forward, but certainly it was
Mhm.
mostly, I think this theory really took off in the 1990s under Bill Clinton with China's accession into the WTO. But it was a
Yes.
mistake, frankly, that was kind of perpetuated by both the Bush administrations and the Obama administrations as well.
Mhm.
And one of the things that history could have taught people who are optimistic about this is that at the end of the day, security concerns are always going to trump economic ones. And you might have significant parts of the country that are invested financially in China's continued growth and continued success, and vice versa. But it's just never going to be enough to really kind of overcome national security concerns. And so I think that's part of what's contributing to the current, what is variously called decoupling or de-risking, but this sort of gradual decrease in the economic relationship, at least in some strategic sectors.
Well, Sean Mirski, is we've become this globalist economy. There's got to be some leadership, and I know when I say that, all of a sudden, the World Economic Forum, and this is what Klaus Schwab, he envisions himself as being the leader of everything. But there's got to be some, beneficent leadership on a global scale that can bring these disparaging forces together for good. Is that just an illusion on my part?
I wouldn't say it's an illusion. I would say that you might be waiting for a while for that to develop. Part of the problem is that is the role that the United States has played in the world essentially since the end of World War II. During the Cold War, obviously, that leadership was limited to sort of the West. Yes. But at least since the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States has tried to play that global leader role. And I think to a significant extent is still trying to play that role. The problem has become that the United States has become comparatively weaker over time. And we're now in a situation where we remain, I think, the strongest power in the world, but our extensive commitments abroad, as well as the mistakes we've made, as well as the trouble, frankly, that we have at home, has meant that our ability to exert that global leadership is somewhat limited. And so, unfortunately, I do think the trends in the long run are kind of towards more of the disorder, both in a political military sense, but also in a sort of economic financial sense. It is getting much, much harder, I think, for nations to sort of come together and agree on commonalities.
Well, Sean, you'd kind of touched on this lightly earlier in the conversation, and it had to do with, in a sense, the way I heard it, is the spiritual background, backbone and morality of this country, and how this has been compromised, and what we're projecting to our allies and the world. I think people around the world think less of America because where we find ourselves spiritually compromised. What do you think?
I think that's certainly part of the story that can be told. I mean, one thing that I would point out is the American attitude towards values and morality, I think since the beginning has been that that time was on our side, that essentially if the United States could just survive and sort of prosper on the North American continent, that over time democracy would naturally spread because it was a superior form of government, and over time the world would democratize. And that was like the prevailing theory ever since the founding, I think, all the way up really, frankly, to the present day.
We're going to be that light on a shining hill, John Winthrop.
Exactly. That, and I think one of the things that Americans, and I think there's much that's true about that story. I mean, I think if you look at foreign people abroad, it is remarkable how in nearly every nation, if given the chance, people would prefer to choose their own leaders. I mean, it doesn't sound that crazy when you put it that way, right? No, right. But at the same time, I think one of the things that the United States has started to learn, or relearn, I should say, is that when the United States is not itself strong, and when democracies are not themselves strong in terms of material power, that has downstream effects for the overall success of democratic ideology. And so in the 1930s, for instance, part of the reason that fascism spread very quickly and spread to multiple nations is because it looked like it was the next successful ideology. Democracy looked like it had failed. It had led to the Great Depression. And it wasn't solving these problems in the way that fascism at that time seemed to be. Exactly. You could tell a similar story about communism in the 40s and the 50s, where for a brief period, it really looked like a much more successful mode of governance, and democracies were on the back foot. And I think you're seeing something today, something similar today, where the American model of governance, in part because of our internal divisions, looks less attractive abroad. And so that there is this sort of ebbing tide of democracy. If you start looking at the statistics, it becomes clear that less and less nations, or fewer and fewer nations, are free. Fewer and fewer nations really qualify as democracies. Part of that is that I think we're getting weaker. Part of that is our internal problems. Part of that is China. As China rises and has different model of governance, it's very attractive, I think.
About a minute left here, Sean Mirski. United Nations, to that end, are they helping or hurting us?
I would say helping, but quite marginally. I think the United Nations gets a lot of criticism for not doing anything, or in some ways being affirmatively unhelpful. And I think much of that criticism is warranted. But at the end of the day, the United Nations is not much more than simply the sum of all the different countries in the world. And so it shouldn't be that surprising that when countries can't agree on stuff, the United Nations can't do much either. But certainly no reason to be looking to the United Nations for the sort of global leadership that you're suggesting, because unfortunately you're just not going to find it there.
Well, when they're dominated by communists, I mean, the leadership, what can you expect? How is that compatible with a democracy?
Yeah, well, and one of the mistakes I think that the United States has made is not to be more involved in the United Nations, because what ends up happening is that a large number of these committees and sort of sub bodies within the United Nations end up getting led by Chinese individuals or by, frankly, other nations. Nationals that simply don't have the same values that we do. And so I do think it is important for us to make sure that we're involved in large part to prevent what you're talking about.
Well, Sean Mirski, thank you for being with us. Sean is a lawyer, U.S. foreign policy scholar who has worked on national security issues across multiple U.S. presidential administrations. His new book, We May Dominate the World, Ambition, Anxiety, and the Rise of American Colossus, available at all the usual places, and a must read so that you really engage your understanding and your level of intelligence of what America is about and what the world is about when it comes to foreign policy and these emerging threats. Sean, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it. You take care.
Thank you for having me, Bill. Take care.
Sean Mirski, our thanks to him. For more information and to be part of this mighty Martinez movement to return to God and to save our country, check it out, BillMartinezShow.com. May God bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you. May he be gracious unto you and give you peace. Go and be a blessing. Thank you for being with us. Take care.